welcome to the show. David Anderson talking market data. Ollie Cadman, I've known you for many years. Let's not worry about when we first got to know each other. The audience probably doesn't care about that. But you and I have both been around the block a few times. To help the audience, I'm going to put your LinkedIn profile in the notes. But could you give a brief, I'm trying to keep this brief, a brief description of your illustrious career?
Illustrious. I'm not sure that's the word I'd use, but
infamous career.
maybe more appropriate. It's 20 years next month that I started in
I'm 40.
space. At the London Stock Exchange, working in the market data team, focused on market data delivery. And since then, have always been focused on data, front office technology, connectivity and access. It's been, whether that be exchanges, banks, and most recently, more in the fintech space.
Briefly done, beautifully done. I'm trying to keep these podcasts to a little bit shorter than my first few, so we'll see if we can manage that. We're gonna talk about a couple of things. One thing briefly, and then another thing at more length. So the first thing I wanted to kick off with is a high-level discussion about data and data policies, the commercial policies that go with data in general, and the fact that that whole area is quite complicated. I mean, the data policies are complicated, the delivery of data is complicated, it's got maybe more complicated over the years. I mean, can you set the scene in your experience in those 20 years? Why is the delivery and the commercial policies of data, why has it been, why does it continue to be difficult?
I think the key thing is, it's a good question. The key thing is it's constantly evolving, right? The way in which data is being used is constantly evolving. The way in which it's being delivered is constantly evolving. And then there's commercial policies being adapted to those shifts in consumption and access, right? If you think about the options that you have now as someone looking to access data, you're blessed with a lot of different options in terms of how you're going to access it. Is it through cloud? Is it over the internet? The proliferation of REST APIs, etc., reducing some of the barriers to entry in that space. How you're going to consume that data and then perhaps commercialize it or deliver it downstream. Obviously has a much bigger impact. And again, there's more options there now. We've seen the shift. If you're a fintech now, you're most likely delivering your platform in a SaaS type manner, which has meant that you've probably become a connectivity provider and a data vendor, whereas previously you were perhaps just providing software. So the way in which people are accessing data, software, etc., has changed. And of course, investment strategies have changed, right? You've got more passive investment strategies. You've got more structured products. We're getting into the AI space. So in a world that regulation has changed, in a world that's constantly changing, it's a bit like regulators are obviously always having to tweak regulation based on usage and based on developments in technologies, digital assets, etc. You've got to do the same, I guess, in terms of the way in which you provide access and control data.
You've just articulated the solution. I've got the solution. Just stop changing. If everybody would would just sit still and keep everything as it always was, there'd be no problem. I'm being facetious, so that's never going to happen.
No, I used to say at one of our previous firms, our life would be a lot easier if we didn't have any customers. It's similar, right? You could just shut the doors and not worry about it. But realistically, as an industry, we want to keep innovating and evolving and pushing the boundaries and exploring. But it's got to be done in a way that is scalable and supportable, and that drives change.
And I think that constant change, I mean, that's the reality. And that's, as you just articulated, that's part of the issue we're all struggling with. And then there's people talking, I mean, my flippant comment about let's just stop innovating, which will never happen and should never happen. And then there's the standardization discussion that everybody said, well, if we just standardized everything, then everything would be easier. But I think your point about innovation, everybody's trying to innovate. Everybody's trying to make things better, more attractive. And in doing that, they're making it different. They're changing it. It's part of that change. And if you try to standardize, I think that the resistance, the obstacle to standardization is innovation. The fact that everybody's trying to do things better. And by definition, if you do things better, you're doing it differently.
Yeah, I think they're always friction. There's always friction between those two goals, right? How do we innovate, but how do we also do it in a way that allows for scale? And I think one of the challenges we've had in our industry is, that constant rate of change. The fact that consumes expertise and resources, and the fact that perhaps that expertise and resource pool is dwindling. Perhaps over time. I know that's a topic that's been, if you put your other hat on, that's a topic that's been discussed at FISD a few times.
Yeah.
So standards almost try and address some of those some of those needs. They don't necessarily, but then they bring with it perhaps a slower pace of change, and perhaps the ability to innovate then happens outside of those standards, which then creates diversity.
It's almost like King Canute trying to stop the waves. You can't do what King Canute tried to do to stop the waves. It's inevitable. It's happening all the time. Constant change is the reality that we're facing with, which I think is a very neat segue into the real meat and potatoes of what we want to talk about. And look, I want you to talk a little bit about your new venture, because your new venture addresses this. So please don't do too much of a sales pitch, but I think a bit of a sales pitch explaining how you're riding to the rescue of the industry in respect of a lot of things. So that constant change we've just discussed is inevitable. It's going to happen. Maybe we can slow some of it down. I don't know whether we should slow it down, but that's a separate discussion. Or there are, as I see it, and help me out here, there are sort of two dimensions to change, at least. One of those is the data policies are complicated as of today, as of now, but then they're constantly changing as well. So there's a constant change of the way the commercial policies for data happens. Then, as I would say, on a more technical stream, there's a constant change of the technical specifications of how you access that data, which could also be to do with data models and the semantics of how data is structured or whatever. And again, there's a constant set of change going on with those. And that creates a headache for, well, I think all us, even the people who are doing the changes, they're doing it for good reasons, but it creates problems for them. There are also, the consumers of all that data, there are problems for them. And I think the nub of it is this whole notification genre, if I can call it this. And I've been aware of notifications being an issue with my FRSD hat on as well, but in the industry, that if you're a consuming firm, you're just getting hit with a flood of notifications, change notifications that you have to act upon. And I suppose if you're a data provider, an exchange or something, or an aggregating data vendor, you're making changes, and then you've got the problem of communicating those to your customers and making sure they all adhere to them. I mean, I broaden out, have I set the scene correctly? Is there a bit more to it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good scene set, right? We always talk about three challenges. You've got the volume of notifications. So just the sheer number of, changes coming out of trading venues, exchanges, etc. And rightly so. Why shouldn't they be allowed to, change things? And in some cases, they have to change things.
They should change things. I mean, that's innovation.
And going back to innovation, we want them to change things. And if you look at it on an exchange by exchange level, it's probably quite manageable. Once you look at that, accessing a portfolio of global exchanges and trading venues, and then of course you add data vendors on top of that and the knock-on impact, it becomes pretty substantial. So you've got the volume of notifications, and you touched on some of the drivers there around pricing policy changes, API upgrades, platform changes, connectivity migrations, data center migrations, just new product listings, updates to existing products, rules changes, schedule changes, etc. It's a constant flurry, and it's just making sure that you're staying on top of that and not missing the things that impact you the most, I think is challenge number one. And of course, all these things, like you said, they might come in different mediums, they will be structured differently, they have different information in them, etc. And then there's the knock-on impact of the actual change. So that's sort of the notification of it. And then there's the action that you have to take. Not all of those changes need action, depending on who you are, and everyone will be different. But in many cases, there's going to be an action. So as well as just the monitoring and staying on top of what's happening, then there's the impact of then executing on that change. And then as we touched on earlier, there's the expertise. The access to expertise. Often the people that understand this the most and understand what the impact of that is going to be and which ones matter are the most sort of experienced, probably expensive as well, but experienced resources. And so they're getting consumed by BAU effectively, because in many cases, as much as we talk about innovation, in many cases from a day-to-day perspective, this is BAU. It's run the bank, not change the bank. And you're doing a lot of this work effectively just to, tread water, stay afloat.
I mean, there must be a hierarchy of importance, if you will, in the sense, your business as usual comment. There's stuff that you just need to keep the engine running normally. And then there's bigger stuff, which is radical change that requires even more substantive change? I mean, is that understood? I mean, again, this is a complicated. Somebody should address this.
Yeah, what a good point. Yeah, I mean, not all change is equal, right? You've got day-to-day change, like we said, listings changes, perhaps change in operation depending on the asset class, change in underlyings, etc. And then you've got significant, substantial changes, which might be an entire new policy, I guess, going back to the policy discussion, but an entire data center migration, exchanges, which is still happening, right? Exchanges going through M&A cycles with other exchanges and platforms, or also offering new platforms or new models, like we've seen a lot of the sort of some of the blockchaining and periodic auction pieces that have evolved over the
So
last
there's
decade.
a hierarchy of importance of some sort, and then there's a sort of a matrix I'm building up in my mind here, and then there's who this is. I mean, in sense, the commercial policy changes versus the technical API spec changes. Different people, both in the producing organization and the consuming organization, are interested in different bits of that, or is everybody interested in everything?
Yeah, so a hierarchy of importance, a hierarchy of impact, I would say, rather than hierarchy of
Yeah.
importance, because depending on it's the impact that if you miss something, obviously it's the impact of missing that could result in you being out the market versus perhaps a late start versus not being able to trade something, etc.
So you could have a really tiny little change that is really impactful, and an enormous complicated change that isn't very impactful.
Yeah, I mean, and the impact is different, right? Depending on who you are and the downstream. I mean, when I was at a bank involved in a very large listing of an IPO, the day it listed, you couldn't actually trade it on our platform because of a reference data issue. And so that's reputational as much as it is as anything else. Or you get to the other extreme where you're out the market, and so obviously depending on whether that impacts you as an organization, it impacts your clients downstream,
So
etc.
who decides that hierarchy of impact and who it's relevant for? Is that the responsibility of the producer of the notifications, or the consumer? I mean, this is really impactful. This is marked very impactful, very important. This is marked less important, and this is marked hardly important at all. Or I mean, who decides? Who annotates that? Labels it?
Yeah, I think at the moment that's more of an art than a science. And it's going to depend on the firm and what are your pain points that are more challenging for you based on your processes, structure, expertise, systems, clients, etc. So if an exchange is doing an entire data center migration or changing platform, it's pretty understood that changing their API holistically, it's pretty understood that that's going to have a significant impact for anyone that's connecting directly to them. If they're changing a data policy, it's going to depend how you're using the data, right? And often, I guess the answer to that question is it depends. And so that's why you have to be able to adapt that review and assessment based on what type of market participant you are, and just then all of those internal factors around business model, technical debt, deployment model, platform, etc., etc., etc.
I mean, I'm going to hit you with two questions. Two questions are sort of at the same time and work out which order to approach them in. I mean, one of them is about timing. One of the things I've been aware of in this whole notification space is it's one thing, how do I get the notifications? How do I understand the hierarchy of impact and who it's relevant for and everything? But I suppose related to that hierarchy of impact is, well, how much time, if I'm a consumer firm, do I need to be able to do what I need to do to ingest that correctly? And I suppose that's always going to be, I mean, the customer firms are going to say, well, I'd like 12 years to do that. I'd like, they want as long as possible. I think 6 months or 3 months are sort of magical numbers that I've heard tossed around. But I'm guessing that when the producers had some clever new, wow, if we did it this way, that would be so much better. They would like that immediately addressed. And isn't there a tension there?
There's definitely a friction. And that's not to say that, that's not to say it causes friction, because I think there's a good general modus operandi, I guess, around what that looks like now based on the type of change. And, the exchanges have a very good understanding of what they need, the notice periods they need to give to firms, particularly if they're doing things like technical upgrades. But I do think as things like digital assets come in, and you've got firms entering this space who aren't perhaps familiar with those existing rules of engagement that aren't necessarily written down, that aren't standardized, but are understood.
Everybody sort of knows,
right?
Yeah.
We're seeing I think we're seeing some differences there. Now, they are also using different technologies. And so they're used to the idea of, well, we can just change our API and everyone can consume it within 5 days. And we don't even really need to tell them about it because they'll understand it. But we're starting to see that shift as they go to more the institutional clients that, yes, you do need to put a little bit more rigor and structure around how you manage change, how you communicate it, the timing. But I think to your original point, in an ideal world, would an exchange love to be able to just release stuff tomorrow? I'm sure they would. I haven't worked for one for a while, but I'm sure that hasn't changed. But it actually has the opposite effect sometimes. I know talking to some exchanges, which is they may even shy away from some changes because they just know the impact. Yes, we'd love to do that, but it would trigger conformance for everyone, or it would mean that everyone would have to go through a whole repapering. And so actually we're not going to do that at the moment. So the friction almost becomes more internal to the exchange, I think, than necessarily to the clients, although often that can bleed through depending on other pressures, I guess.
Because I think it's interesting what you said there. I mean, I often picture a situation where if you had a clean sheet of paper and you could say, look, if we designed it now, if we did this all now, we would do it fundamentally different. But everybody's got legacy. Everybody's got it, can't. And the reason I mentioned that digital assets concept, the cryptos and all that stuff is so new that quite often there is a clean sheet of paper, both on the customer side. It's all new, and therefore we know how to do it. Everybody do it this way, and we're off to the races. But with the legacy world that we live in, with the equities exchange data and all the stuff that's been around for 30, 40 years or whatever, it isn't a clean sheet of paper. It's a messy mess that people are addressing. Let me hit you with. I said I was going to do two questions, but the second question is: how is this currently being done? I mean, I would say to you, everything's fine. We all understand this. This has been going on. We all know how to work this. What's the problem, David? Just get on with it. We all there's nothing broke. Why fix it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very simple one-word answer to that, I think, which is people. It's being done with people and resources, manually reviewing, staying on top of all the emails that come in, reviewing them, and then triggering internal actions and workflows and projects off the back of them. Yes, at some point there's probably some attempts to automatically filter out or track, etc. But generally, in all the firms we speak to, I think this process fundamentally hasn't, to your point around the underlying principles haven't changed. Therefore, fundamentally, the process hasn't changed. And that's not to say that people don't know that it should be different. It's just that they're too busy staying on top of it to do it. And unless, like you said about the digital asset stuff, right? So yeah, starting from scratch, much more modern kind of REST, WebSocket APIs, etc. And obviously, we've seen exchanges start to develop that as well as they start to target other types of direct consumers in the market and through cloud, etc. But what we're also seeing is those digital asset firms, as they start to target more institutional firms, have to start adopting the same principles, right? They're developing fixed interfaces, etc. Because that's the way you plug into the existing process and the operating model and the business model, etc. That's supported, legal compliance, procurement, etc. So it's not to say that I think the industry doesn't recognize that there are better ways to do a lot of this, particularly in things like API development and access and platform. But the challenge is it requires a wholesale shift, which we know is a challenge in itself, right, in this industry. And it requires resource and focus and expertise taken away from staying on top of the existing change, which is one of the reasons why I think, here comes the sales pitch, which is one of the reasons why we developed AiMi, because AiMi, AI for Market Infrastructure, with the view that, that we talk about it being operational middleware. The idea that we can actually deliver some of those benefits, those more dynamic, data-driven, digital workflows without having to go through a wholesale rewiring and re-architecture of market access, exchange connectivity, market data consumption, etc., and start to deliver some of those benefits without firms having to do that, go through significant overhauls and programs of change.
I mean, we need to be precise here. You said the word firms. I mean, there are exchanges, aggregating data vendors,
market participants. Yes.
Yeah.
Good point.
So
we're focused on that space. People that are consuming the data or accessing the markets, etc.
So your aim is to give them tools and capabilities. Can you also pivot or add on and provide services to the exchanges and the aggregating data vendors? I mean, is it a whole ecosystem opportunity?
Yeah, I'm sure we can. My first job when I started at the London Stock Exchange was customer readiness coordinator for the migration to Infolect, which really is showing
That's
my age there.
trips off the tongue, doesn't it, that way?
Yeah, but I was tracking the status of every single client. Have they conformed? Have they upgraded, etc.? So there's no reason why you couldn't build more of a workflow that allows the exchange to better track that. That's not where we're focused now, but one of the things I really like about where we are is we've spoken to 25, 30 firms who all tell us,
Customer
yes, this is
firms,
a
user
customer firms.
Yeah.
Yes, who all tell us, market participants, who all tell us that yes, this is a problem. And every time we have a conversation with someone, there's a new use case or a new idea for how this could work. So as people start to see the benefits and understand what we're trying to do, they start to think themselves about, well, could it also do this? Could it also do that? So I guess to your point, there are 100 other things that it could do in the future that would help address this space and manage the wider life cycle. We're focused initially on change, but there's optimization, there's onboarding. One of the things I've learned when you're starting a firm, right, focus on one thing and go from there. But I think there's lots of ways it could go in the future if we're successful, definitely.
So, how do you do this? I mean, if you can just maybe focus a little bit we touched on it, but going to drill down a bit into how it's done. We know it's done by people, and you've thrown in, I'm going to put you on the spot here, you've thrown in a few concepts that I recognize, but I confess I don't fully understand, REST APIs versus old school APIs. I mean, try and educate all of us a bit more on some of this stuff. Let's put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think how is it done? It's done primarily in the traditional software development lifecycle way. Change comes in, it has to be assessed, impacted, and then executed.
In an email from...
Often in an email, in a PDF, notification on the website. So the trigger comes from some external data source that says something's happening here. And then that will trigger an internal process. That process could be a data management process that we now need to make sure that these instruments are available within our system, or maybe we need to remove them, or we need to do an upgrade of our API so that we're now processing this new message, or that we're processing this new field in this message to ensure that that passes downstream to the consumers. So
because at the consumer firm, it isn't one entity. It's the department that's receiving those notifications. Then there are all the other departments sitting within that big complicated bank or whatever it is. And that, each of them could have a different impact on them, and therefore it's got to sort of propagate its way through that firm.
You've got multiple business lines, you've got multiple applications, so the impact is going to vary depending on the business. At the most simple level, it's, does this exchange impact that application, or does it, do you even trade this market? Do you take this data source? No. Okay, easy. Yes, you do. Are you using this data? Are you using the fields, these messages that are changing? Yes, you are. Okay. Is this a mandatory change? Is it going to break something if we don't do it? Or is this an optional change that it's functionality that you might want to take advantage of? Or it's a new data set that you might want to start consuming?
So the consumer firm goes through a process of assessing the impact for them.
Triaging it. Yeah, exactly. Triage it, impact, understand the assessment, and then based on that, build a plan around track the actual implementation where required.
Do the producers of the data provide any advice on impact? Or is it just, here is the change? Or does it say, here is the change, and we think you might need to do this and that, and here's what we think the impact will be? Or do they typically just tell you what the change is?
Generally, they'll tell you what the change is. But of course, and again, I don't want to make it sound like exchanges don't do a lot, and providers and platform providers don't do a lot here to try and manage this process as efficiently as possible. They try and provide as much information as possible. They'll flag it with you. They'll support any questions that you have around it and make sure that it's as effective and seamless as possible. The challenge is we're working in a space where there is a lack of standardization, and then the impact is very specific to each organization because it's down to how they consume it, how they use it, how they've developed their feed handler and different firms. I remember working with a vendor when I was at an exchange who just said, you have to give us this much notice because we've contractually committed to our clients to provide that much notice. So it's almost they've got a contractual commitment that they've got themselves into that they are now saying we have to hold ourselves. So there's so many aspects. And I think that's been one of the challenges in addressing this space previously is it's non-deterministic in many ways. And it's the way in which you have to apply meaning and context to this isn't 2 + 2 = 4. And that's why I think that's where we've ended up now being the right time for this, which is it's not all about AI. AI is obviously a buzzword at the moment, but the generative AI capabilities I always say it, and the missing piece of what is a wider solution. And as that's come along, I think it's given us the ability to start to address this in a much more programmatic way.
So is the AI layer in lieu of, instead of, there's a human being watching their email box, and they're the person or the department that receives all these notifications, and somebody has to read those emails and think, how important is that, and who do I have to tell internally about that, and so on and so forth. Is that where you place the AI? Is the AI layer doing a better filtering job, a better reading job, a better explain to me, to
Which
us?
initially we're using it in that space to categorize. So we've developed our own ontology. That's a word I find myself using a lot more these days, but we call it a service catalog of like the context. We've developed a catalog of exchanges, menus, forms, faces, services that we provide to the AI, the LLM, to give it context. So here's a notice, and here's the catalog, and categorize this notice based on this catalog, so that you can start to put, we always say about codifying the data, you can start to put meaning around these notices, metadata in that sense, that then allows you to drive those downstream workflows. Because if you know this is a notice from the London Stock Exchange that's going to impact Group Ticker Plant, and it's a platform upgrade and it's going live on this date, you can then more deterministically understand, well, okay, then these are the people this is going to impact, and this is what we need to do about it. So by putting that codification, that meaning around these notices, and that's where I think the LLM really helps. And it's not just LLM; we use other AI as well.
I mean,
that's the value.
Just breaking that down. But and I'm making these up, by the way, just for the purposes of an example. So the LSE could say, this is a change on our feed XYZ, and it relates to level 1. It defines a whole set of elements that you just described. But then Deutsche Börse, being Deutsche Börse, does it in a different order and uses completely different descriptions for the different elements. So I presume there's quite a big training element to train the LLM or the model to understand the difference of how LSE speaks and how Deutsche Börse speaks. That must be difficult.
Essentially, yes. And in that case, actually, you're probably getting more into machine learning and natural language processing than you are generative AI for some of those use cases. But being able to understand and extract the relevant aspects of that requires a combination of the context, a lot of prompt engineering. So actually refining what we're asking the LLM to do with that information and tweaking it based on certain aspects to say, and if it talks about this, understand that it means this. So bringing that expertise angle into play through internal data sources and educating the model. I'm hesitating saying training. We don't actually do model training at the moment on purpose. The whole point is we're managing change here. And so training a model on a snapshot in time of what it looks like isn't actually going to help us manage change. So what we use a lot more of is, if you've heard the term retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is
I've heard RAG. Yeah, I
real
don't
time.
Understand it. But I've
me
heard
neither.
it.
But, no,
Tim Baker talks about it all the time.
It's real-time injection of context and data. So there's no point us taking a data policy or exchange spec and training the model on that, because when it changes, the model is no longer up to date. So you're actually injecting those types of things into the model effectively in real time, along with the context, along with the prompts, to be able to give it all of the context it needs.
Well, anybody who's watching this, in the comments below, either explain what RAG is or give us some links to idiot guides to what RAG is, because Ollie and I are idiots. We're intelligent idiots.
Take a lot of firms are using it to say they plug in their Confluence or plug in their SharePoint site, so that real-time personalized content is being combined with the underlying knowledge of the model from whenever it was last trained. And so that's what we're using RAG for.
Let me ask you an AI question. I mean, AI is wonderful. It helps us a lot, but AI hallucinates. AI has bias. Those seem to be the two big things that, especially with generative AI. AI needs explainability. So there's still a human point. Somebody has to take responsibility. So this...
Yes.
How does that work? And doesn't that need just as many people to do that?
So we always talk about being co-pilot, not autopilot. And so we're looking to assist and accelerate the work that people are doing, not replace it. If you can review those 200 notices in half the time, because we've done the we've done 80%, maybe even less than half the time, 20% of the time, because we've done 80% of the work of putting that meaning around it. It still needs to be reviewed and validated. And that we have that as a key point in the process. It's not something we're trying to remove. We think that's important. The existing guardrails still remain. It's accelerating the manual steps that happen between each of those guardrails so that people can spend their time managing the exceptions rather than managing the BA. They can actually focus on the areas that need their focus, because this is an extremely complex change coming in that we need to review versus, okay, we understand that's a data change, that will go live tomorrow, done. Move it through the process.
Ollie, I'm conscious of time, and as we chatted before we came online, I'm trying to do these shorter. I mean, you and I could talk about this. I'm loving this conversation. We could go on and on, but let's try and keep it tight so that we sort of pull this in within the 40 to 45 minute time slot. I'll welcome you back. We can talk more about this on another episode. Can I get into a sort of conclusion set and ask you the question, what questions? Where do you find the most questions? I won't say objections, but if they are when you're talking to people, do people just say, hey, let me find my checkbook and give you vast sums of money immediately so we can do this, or not? And why?
Of course they do. No, I think we touched on the objections, which is AI in our space is still relatively new. I mean, it's relatively new generally. It's only a few years old, but in our space, it's particularly new. And there are concerns around how you use AI and the traceability and explainability and the hallucinations, etc. And that's why we're taking very small steps. That's why we talk about guardrails. We're primarily using categorization and summarization at the moment. We are talking to firms about trying to get into that triaging, making it more personalized so that we can start to give you more personalized impact assessments of, you don't use this data feed, so therefore actually this change isn't going to impact you. But we believe, and it's only a small part of a wider automation solution, which is as you categorize, you can then start to build deterministic automation around that codified data to give you the right outputs. So naturally, people are hesitant around the AI piece, and that's why we always say we're taking small steps with AI, and we're doing it in a very transparent and open way. You can see exactly what it's doing. You know when AI has been used, and you still have all of those checkpoints along the way to make sure that the outputs are correct and right for you.
I mean, are you sensing that people, when they pose those objections, it's like, it was lovely hearing from you, Ollie. I've got all these objections, and we're saying an absolute no, never darken our door, don't come back, don't waste our time. I'm sure they don't say that, but that's the worst case scenario. Or are they saying, hey, we really like this idea, we maybe even love it, but we're going to need a bit more time. It may take us a couple of years before we get to this, or six. I mean, where is this at? Where's the gestation of all this?
I'd say it's even more encouraging than that. We weren't originally going to launch the platform until this quarter, and we launched it last quarter because we were having some early conversations, and all of the feedback was very positive. So we wanted to get out there and have more of those conversations, and that's what we're having. And they're very encouraging. People are very interested, very keen. They have their apprehension, but they also see the benefits and understand where this is going. So I wouldn't say we fall into either of those categories nicely. We actually fall into this is interesting, and let's.
But on that
spectrum
of dark gloom and eternal optimism, you're nearer the positive.
We're nearer absolutely. I think we're definitely on the positive side, and we know from some of the conversations that we've had with clients that they've been looking at this themselves internally. It's just that we feel that we can do it in a more scalable way that delivers greater value for everyone.
Isn't one of your problems that the people are running so fast dealing with the problem you're going to solve that they haven't got time, or enough time, if that's the right word, to look at addressing it? I mean, it's like, we're so busy, we haven't got time to talk about how you can make us less busy. Is there
always the challenge? Yeah, these guys are getting stretched in multiple different directions, and you've got to how do you slow down to speed up? That's why we provide it as a fully managed service. We bring the expertise with us so that we can plug in incrementally to your existing process. It goes back to that whole idea of this isn't a wholesale shift. You can start to piecemeal to deliver these benefits, free up capacity that allows you to deliver more benefits, that allows you to free up more capacity. It's very iterative, and we deliver it in that way for exactly that reason.
Okay. Let me give you free reign for like 2 or 3 minutes. Anything that we haven't talked about in the last 38 minutes, 49 seconds that you really wanted to say to this audience? You've got about 2 or 3 minutes just to, free flow, mega sales pitch, anything. Say anything you'd like.
I think we've covered most of the key points, and I don't like to come onto these things and just try and sell, but
we're joking. Let's be honest, you've got a young business, and at the end of the day, if the community doesn't support a good idea, it won't happen. So, selling isn't bad. You're telling people absolutely a solution.
So we are using generative AI to manage the change cycle in capital markets infrastructure, focused on capturing and categorizing that change, managing the change workflow, and then also scaling expertise. Actually, one of the things we didn't talk about is we are going through and capturing all of these documents, technical specifications, functional documents, policy documents, etc. And they're all available within the model, which means we also have a natural chat co-pilot as well. So you can start to ask questions. You can ask questions of what are the auction phases at the LSE? What's the hosting offering of Deutsche Börse, etc. I feel like we picked on LSE a lot, sorry.
So that is a sort of training.
access-
You are sort of training in a part of it. Is training the right word?
We're not, I guess in AI, training has very specific meaning. And we're, again, doing that much through more contextual RAG type provision. But it's with the goal of scaling some of that expertise. The other thing that these experts get consumed by is just questions from across the firm. There's normally that guy that knows how we connect to NASDAQ and knows what the policies are because they developed it and they implemented it. And so they get all of the questions. So if we can start to bring more of that information into the platform, we can start to scale that expertise, which goes back to those iterative releases of capacity within the organization. So we address those 3 points, which is the volume of notifications and sort of seeing the wood for the trees, optimizing the change management workflow and process so that you're looking at the stuff that you need to, and we're accelerating that process, and then scaling expertise. We focused on connectivity and exchange platform and API upgrade management, but we're having conversations with firms across all of the aspects of vendor policy, rulebook, and all of the other types of changes that come in.
Again, I did an interesting podcast, episode 5, which launched a while back, Nimish Brady. We were talking about APAC. I mean, what's your sort of geographic? We've got like 2 minutes. I mean, are you starting with Europe? I mean, what baby steps?
Europe and US. Given experience, location, focus, Europe and US is the main focus. We cover Asia exchanges. So I guess there's 2 aspects of that. Coverage, global. We've got a number of the major exchanges from Asia covered. Consumers and target firms, we're focused a little bit more on Europe and US initially, just because of where we are and the time zones. And again, not trying to do too much too soon.
If you overstretch, you create a problem.
We want to do things well and build up and scale up from there.
Ollie, I've enjoyed this. I hope you have. We could talk more on this, and I think we should. So I'll ask people to ask questions, so that potentially we can provide more information. Ollie's details will be definitely up on the YouTube notes. I've yet to work out how to do Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where to put details, but I'll try and do that as well. Do you want to say your website? I might try and put it in the. I'll try and put it in the, as an annotation. But say it now as well.
Yeah. It's AiMi, AiMi.technology. So
the full word technology.
Technology, yes.
Is it not .com?
Yeah, it's not .com, just AiMi, AiMi.technology. And we'll be happy to speak to anyone.
And typically your policy is you'll respond within 3 months or 6 months. I couldn't resist that, sorry. Anyway, look, it's been a pleasure. We're 43 minutes and 5 seconds, so we're within the 45 minutes I aim for. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Well, I'm ending now.